Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is another 25 pages of hope and folly. The United States and UNESCO, 1945 to 1985, William Preston, Edward Herman, and Herbert Schiller. So we're going to get started. As usual, I have the book link in the description section, so please download the book. The Google Drive link will be in the description section. You can grab the PDF. And I recommend you buy all of my books. You read all of my books and buy them because they will be effective for you. Now, we're going to talk about prestige. We're going to talk about prestige for a short bit. We're going to talk about the prestigious Yankee con artist, right? So, the reason I'm doing these book reviews, there's a lot of books. You'll see my website. You'll see my, YouTube channel, Krishna Iyer YouTube channel. It has a bunch of books that I have, read and, found, very interesting. Okay. The Yankee government, the Yankee press, the Yankee academia has a lot of prestige in the world. And, my assessment is they have conned the world for that prestige. They have lied. They're con artist Yankee whites that have, lied to everyone, and they don't deserve that prestige. It is akin to giving a rapist butcher a Yankee prestige. Nobody gives like anyone in any country that has committed such criminal acts of aggression, criminal things against Hispanic people, criminal things against Asian people, criminal things against African people, and then give them prestige. Okay, this is a con artist prestige system of the West. Either it's a con artist system and the West just gives them prestige because they like what they look like, or it's just they're systematically using, their con artist prestige to promote a military dictatorship of gun violent white Yankees. I don't know what it is, but the prestige needs to be decreased. And the reason I bring this up is because we really need to reanalyze Yankee prestige. We really need to reanalyze the Yankee government's prestige and how it garnered it. You look at the last four invasions. Let's take, the first invasion, Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter in El Salvador, right? How did he get the Nobel Prize? The guy is a mass murderer. He's he pretended humanitarianism. He had Archbishop Romero assassinated in El Salvador. He had Hispanics butchered, in the thousands and thousands, up to 100,000 Hispanics were butchered in El Salvador during Jimmy Carter's term. He backed Somoza, a military butcher of Hispanics, a Yankee, puppet. He backed all these colonial, fascist, racist, butcher dictatorships. And he got the Nobel Prize. So he is, obviously not a candidate for the Nobel Prize. And he was given this in a fraud. It is a fraud. It is a fraud. It's a Western racist Oscar award. It's not useful. So let's go to the next president, Ronald Reagan. He was also a prestigious president, right? You read about him in the American press and the Western press. He's like prestigious. They liked him. He was friends with Margaret Thatcher. He, did, so many things that were, illegal. His Contra war of aggression was a terrorist war. America was a terrorist state when they waged war against the Sandinistas. He had, the Sandinistas terrorized, and, he had a corrupt election, the unfair elections, both in El Salvador and in Nicaragua, that, he complained about the Nicaraguan election, yet the El Salvador election was completely fraudulent. It was completely fraudulent. It was a machine gun election, and they were not supposed to talk about it. The press was specifically told to be silent regarding the, the election, appearance. So this is an enterprise of prestige garnering con artist Yankees. They are con artist Yankees that look for prestige, short-term gains by just quickly murdering a lot of Hispanics and then say, to the Europeans, we did a great job. Look at us, right? We look good, and we quietly, slaughtered these Hispanic people and butchered them like, rapist Yankee butchers. And, the Europeans are happy with it. So that's the first thing. Those are the presidents. And then we talk about Panama. The last one I'm going to talk about is Panama. Another one that George Bush went in and, slaughtered hundreds and thousands of Hispanics. Not hundreds of thousands. He slaughtered 5,000 Hispanics. But the U.S. government and their press said there were no casualties, right? We can, picture a joke with Ted Koppel, right? Ted Koppel came on the air and, nice trim, Ted Koppel, Teddy, nice trim Yankee Teddy. He comes on the air with a nice suit and tie looking trim and, nice looking guy. And, he just says that, We are, a simple culture. The Yankee culture is simple. We are simple Yankees, and we do good for people. And, Bush went into Panama, and, he could accomplish so much with no debts, right? I mean, yeah, hey, Teddy, what about the doctors, your GI slaughtered because they didn't want treatment? What about the 5,000 people that were killed? So what does Teddy say in that case? Well, we're a simple culture. And, like I said, it'll all work out. It'll all work out. We're a simple group of people, Yankees. We're a simple group of Yankees. Then, these things happen. These things happen. It's, an inevitable part of war, right? I mean, 5 years later, it's an inevitable part of war, right? I mean, 5 years after you hit the casualties, it's an inevitable part of war when the statistics come out. So this is a con artist group of Yankees. The Yankees are con artists. They're Yankee frauds. They're Yankee con artists. And, I just want to say that this presentation is for prestige. The short-term goals are not, me. I'm not into short-term goals. I'm into a long-term analysis of American prestige. Let's rethink this, group of Yankees that have garnered so much prestige in the world when they deserve to be in the prisons in The Hague, right? These are these are international war criminals. They're racist, rapist, butcher, and, butcher Yankees. And then they don't deserve prestige. And then there are con artists who cover up their, butcher rape of Hispanics, Asians and Africans. So that's the first thing. The second thing we're going to talk about is the poor analysis by the academia con artists. All right, the con artist academia of the Yankees, the Yankee academia, they're not scholars. They basically read the propaganda. Their internet analysis is, basically the analysis you get. They read the propaganda of the Yankee government. They read the Yankee propaganda, and basically, they recite the propaganda for the people, right? I mean, it's not historical, it's not factual. It's just con artists, Yankees. The con artist Yankees. They're con artist Yankees that put together nothing, properly. So basically, the long-term goal of these presentations are decrease the prestige of the United States, evaluate the facts, and do an honest analysis of American imperialism and American, colonialism, and you say that does America deserve this international prestige? That is the long-term answer that I have is no. It is a fraudulent prestige. It is a con artist group of Yankees. They're not deserving of this. They need to be in the world of uncivilized nations. They need to be in the world of violent white Yankees that are uncivilized and not becoming of, a world power. They should be associated with countries that are uncivilized, that are, military dictatorships, ruthless, brutal white, rapist, butcher Yankees. So that's what I say. So this presentation is about UNESCO. We always talk about UNESCO. My statement in this presentation, and that's the reason why I'm doing this particular book, is please expel UNESCO from expel the United States, the Yankees, from UNESCO. The United States is in the United Nations Scientific, Cultural, and Educational Organization of the Third World. It doesn't deserve to be in this prestigious organization that, promotes upliftment of third world people. It doesn't deserve to be an organization that promotes science, mathematics, physics, chemistry, all of these things, applying minimum standards for education and academia in the third world. The United States, got out of this organization. They waged war and libel campaign because they couldn't turn it into an anti-nationalist organization of American imperialism. In 1984, they withdrew because it couldn't become a national organization of American imperialism. UNESCO refused to submit to American power demands that they become an imperialist, spokesman and broker of American foreign policy. And so they withdrew in 1984. And then 37 years out, they didn't pay a dime. They didn't care about the third world development. They had no interest in the third world. And then they come back in 2023, sneak back in, just like willy-nilly. You can just sneak back in into an organization for third world upliftment. And then what did you do? You waged war against 3 member states, right? I mean, what is that, Yankee? What is that? That requires an expulsion from UNESCO. That action of you're waging war against 3 member states after being out for 37 years and then rejoining and then waging war against member states of UNESCO means you need to be expelled from UNESCO Washington. You just don't deserve to be in a prestigious organization by UNESCO, like UNESCO. You need to be kicked out by the UNESCO administrative body. And that's why I'm doing this presentation, because America, the Yankees, need to be kicked out of UNESCO because they don't belong there. They're a threat to the organization's, integrity. They're a threat to its goals. They're a threat to its, its proper conduct. They will turn it into a pro-imperialist, pro-colonialist organization of subversion of third world nationalism. And so get out is what I say for the UNESCO committee. Tell America to get out of UNESCO. They don't belong there. And then we're also going to talk about YouTube. Again, I put these presentations on YouTube every day. I'm going to keep doing it because, again, my goal is a long-term goal of American prestige, to decrease American prestige and arrogance over the long term, because they are, poor. They are poor. They're con artist Yankees. They're fraud Yankees. They're liar Yankees. And they're fabricator and falsifier Yankees. They do not deserve any of the prestige they get. And so this is a long-term project for me. It's not a one-day thing. So if the Yankees think that, somehow it's going to stop because, I don't, get the Trump ICJ conviction, or I don't get a UNESCO, removal or expulsion. Think again, Yankee. Over time, people are going to understand you through these presentations, and then they're going to, know what to say when they think about the Yankees. So that's the reason I do them, not for short-term goals, not for short-term prestige, because the Yankees, that's all they do things for. They do things for short-term goals, a quick machine gun murder, and you can, remove the competition. Right, Yankees, right, Washington, that's the way it is. Just a quick machine gun, right? We're, nice, cool guys of Yankee imperialism, and, we, just machine gun them, and, it was a quick win, right? I mean, it was giving us a hard time, and it was a quick win, right? Just like, Venezuela's Maduro. It was a quick win. We just kind of galloped in like, nice Yankee, good looking, GIs, and, just, abducted the leader of a democratic UNESCO nation. So that's the American government. That's the Yankees. Trump International Court of Justice, again, we recommend Trump be placed in the International Court of Justice. He should be an arrestee. We don't really care what happens because, it's a prestigious, prestige to get out of the ICJ conviction for a Yankee white. Okay, it's prestigious, so, they're going to follow the prestige guidelines of a fraudulent colonial court. And he's going to get away with murder of these 3, member UNESCO states and 3 international member states of the UN without any kind of repercussions. That's the way the European courts are. They're a racist group of courts. But Trump needs to be in the ICJ. He needs to be an arrest warrant if justice is to be served to Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba. That's the way it should be. The U.S. witch hunting against UNESCO we talked about yesterday. The U.S. are witch hunters. They are Yankee witch hunters that tried UNESCO on, trials of fraud and, all sorts of distortions that UNESCO was saying. They distorted the facts and turned it into a transference of their own, guilty, distortions, lies, and fabrications in their Yankee press, their Yankee fraud press, their Yankee fraudulent media that, goes around and lies over and over and fabricates stories and gives us garbage, just garbage in print, garbage on the news. Don't read the Yankee press. It's a worthless Yankee garbage, distribution of fascist Yankee propaganda. So that's what it is. That's what it is. I would definitely not read the Yankee news because it is fascist Yankee government propaganda. So next we're going to talk about scientific fraud, right? So UNESCO again, right? We talk about UNESCO. The goals of UNESCO are science, education, and culture. Culture is a huge thing. We talked about cultural imperialism of the Yankee culture. They want to export culture. They don't think culture is a real concept. Indigenous cultures have no rights or no real, recourse against Yankee colonial rapist butcher Yankees. So that's what happens. The culture is, forgotten, and the Yankees export their culture. And they waged a war against UNESCO because the UNESCO organization was pushing for cultural equality. They were pushing to push forward the cultures and, education, science, literacy. They were pushing literacy. The Yankees want, here and there a third world monument to be, reconstructed or, preserved. And here and there a third world literacy child, given, like in China, and 1.6 billion people, you make one literate child, and it's all right. We, did our job for literacy. That's the Yankees. They are, short-term prestige mongers and, fraud, con artists, Yankees. They're short-term prestige mongers. They love prestige, and, they are, con artists, Yankees for prestige. So scientific fraud, basically we talked about, fraud, the Yankee propaganda, the Yankee, scientific fraud. It's a quick prestige to publish, prestige to, get a quick, publication, prestigious journals like Science and Nature. But, mathematics, the same thing. A quick prestigious theorem, and you put it out there. You get the Nobel Prize in mathematics. You're, prestigious. You shoot it into a computer, quick prestige. It's a fraud. It's a con artist group of Yankees. They're, chemical experimentation. They use, they make big Nobel Prize experiments. And then it turns out to be chemical weapons used to murder people. And that's how they get their prestige. It's a group of con artist Yankees. They're con artist Yankees. So let's quickly go through the, the ethics quiz. It's a quick quiz. I'm going to just talk about true false questions. It's for my giggle session. Remember, this is the giggle session. Be aware that a giggle session is to begin, so we want to giggle. So keep yourself, giggling, because that's always good in the morning and in the evening. And so, U.S. press became paranoid as it saw victory slipping away and used gross distortions and even demagogic ideas to repudiate the UN and UNESCO. So that's true. The U.S. press became paranoid as it saw victory slipping away and used gross distortions, even demagogic, to repudiate the UN and UNESCO. The U.S. press used ideologic crusade to convert UNESCO into a tool for national Yankee self-interest as the primary goal of the organization. That's true. We read that yesterday. The U.S. press used ideologic crusade to convert UNESCO into a tool for national Yankee self-interest as the primary goal of the organization. The Yankee media seemed unaware of its own self-interest and saw their media fraud information as an instrument of truth, providing spiritual nourishment, right? I mean, it's a cultural nourishment, spiritual nourishment. The Yankee media seemed unaware of its own self-interest and saw their media fraud information program as an instrument of truth, right? Providing spiritual nourishment. Truth sayer Yankees, true. William Benton of the State Department found UNESCO a great medium to influence men's minds to turn the scientific organization into a tool for anti-communism. Right? I mean, William Benton of the State Department found UNESCO a great medium to influence men's minds to turn this scientific organization, an education and cultural organization, into a tool for anti-communism. Mass communications and free flow doctrine of total fraud were designed to make UNESCO operation technologically effective and ethically supreme, and were designed to free the United States of its being held responsible for cultural imperialism. That's also true. The mass communications and free flow doctrine of total fraud were designed to make UNESCO operation technologically effective and ethically supreme, and were designed to free the U.S. of being held responsible for cultural imperialism. The Yankee government launched a virulent, corrupt, and clandestine provision of servitude in which the U.S. Yankee witch hunt dispatched UNESCO as a tool of American foreign policy. That's also true. That's also true. It was a Yankee witch hunt that was dispatched by UNESCO as a tool of American foreign policy. This UNESCO goals, we didn't worry about the goals. That's Washington. They need to be expelled from UNESCO. The U.S. press and government were childish and demeaning and using their immense power and financial resources to induce a manic response in UNESCO, to listen to Yankee imperialist goals over its own goals. That's also true. The U.S. press and government were childish and demeaning in using their immense power and financial resources to induce a manic response in UNESCO, to listen to Yankee imperialist goals over its own goals. The Yankee con artist press journalist practices were uniformly disliked by the third world smaller countries who found them cultural imperialists and needed to safeguard their own infant information industries from Yankee media predators and protect their people from distorted American journalism. That's also true. That's also true. We read that yesterday. Yankee journalism ethics includes deliberate lying, missiles of fabrication, and censorship. That's also true. That's also true. Pretty straightforward. The Yankee press were opposed to countries that found their journalism as false information and irresponsible perversion of or suppression of the truth. That's true. The Yankee press were opposed to countries that found their journalism false and irresponsible perversion and suppression of the truth. The Yankee press sought to utilize UNESCO to monitor anti-American propaganda and restrict the truthful flow of information. That's true. The Yankee press sought to change UNESCO as a means of monitoring anti-American propaganda and restricting its truthful flow of information. The Yankee media outlets used ideological warfare to join in the crusade against UNESCO, to converting the ideology of the organization into an anti-communist struggle, which effectively converted UNESCO into an ideological crusade, completely fraudulent with UNESCO principles. That's also true. It was an ideological crusade by the Yankees. Okay, Yankee fraud Columbia psychology professor Henry Garrett argued civilization depended on racial separation because scientific statistics proved the existence of racial inferiority. That's true. We talked about the Yankee con artists, Columbia academia. Yankee government fostered linked educational and cultural affairs of the third world to worthless tasks to be overshadowed by anti-communism. That's also true. The cultural affairs and educational affairs of the third world was becoming ascribed worthless and overshadowed by anti-communism. Not wishing to seek control of cultural reciprocity, the Yankee press and government created an overseas American educational imperium in which foreign scholars from any country not allies with the Yankees could not participate in conferences and educational discussion. That's also true, so remember that. All right? All right, so we're going to get started. We're going on page 73. We're going to try to go to 98. The covert side. The indictment could have been much stronger. The national security establishment had a program underway from war's end that rivaled and subverted its principle. Everything that the United States proclaimed about, both in its commitment to UNESCO and its development of cultural relations as humanitarian adjuncts to the conduct of its foreign policy. Rather than help build the defenses of peace in the minds of men and learn from other cultures, the U.S. had sheltered and admitted the very Nazi war criminals whose atrocities had just so shocked the world community, a policy, moreover, that violated the Nuremberg principles, the UN Charter, and the express will of the American Congress, apart from its own repulsive ethical dimension. Initiated in the same years in which the UN and UNESCO were first established with America's enthusiastic support, the rescue of war criminals had intelligence and national defense objectives tied to anti-communism and space research. The former included sharing wartime anti-Soviet secrets the Nazis had developed and providing access to anti-Soviet forces for guerrilla warfare, and in the hope for liberation of Eastern Europe by National Security Council's secret directive, a special intelligence operation unit. The Office of Policy Coordination came to life in 1948, essentially bypassing the CIA and, of course, Congress. Besides moving Nazi assets into the United States as reform degrees or POWs with sanitized records, the OPC planned subversion, political actions behind the Iron Curtain. The Operation Paperclip, meanwhile, brought in the educational exchange component. Hitler's ex-rocket scientists, under forged papers with incriminating material, deleted. Both the CIA and the Defense Department also had exceptions under the immigration laws to bring in 100 ineligibles a year. With the budget over half that of the CIA, and irony in terms of UNESCO's paltry finances, the OPC waged an undeclared war against the Soviet Union while Army intelligence facilitated the Nazi escape to Latin America with the help from the Vatican. As time went on, the OPC set up fronts including Radio Liberty, organized refugee committees of liberation, laundered money, secretly financed cultural organizations, and stimulated internal purges by campaigns of disinformation. In Poland and the USSR, its Nazi refugees broadcast American propaganda on Radio Free Liberty and Radio Free Europe. Although the guerrilla subversion against the USSR was compromised and failed completely, the information and scientific exchanges must be rated as Cold War successes. Like all such operations, they maintain their secret identity by cover-ups and routine purges of the files and obstructed justice with the assistance of DoD, FBI, INS, state, and CIA, which in the early 1950s superseded the OPC, taking over responsibility for covert operations. Having sampled the attractions of covert cultural operations in the immediate post-war period and shown its willingness to recruit war criminals or freedom fighters, the national security and intelligence systems preempted much of the new areas arena of our international influence. The world to which UNESCO conveyed its messages of peaceful and mutual understanding had, in a sense, been hijacked by U.S. national interests, ready to project a secret intelligence imperialism as part of the free-flow market format that it had insisted UNESCO adopt. This New World Intelligence Order mocked the ideals of self-determination, cultural autonomy, and the independence of ideas, and reintroduced the false and distorted propaganda of distrust that had been the very poison leading to World War II. And this program comprised the State Department's openly administered educational and cultural outreach as well, since its hidden dimension seemed merely to be the function of those many agencies of information that form and define the free market of ideas. Favored with immense resources, these CIA-led intrusions into UNESCO's field of operations had endless congressional funding for their cultural activities that neither UNESCO nor the State Department could ever obtain on its own. The U.S. obviously preferred secrecy while waging its ideological warfare on behalf of freedom. As pieces of the worldwide involvement in the shaping of men's minds came to light in the late 1960s and 1970s, the evidence portrayed an immense covert presence in networks and newspapers, news agencies, radio broadcasting, book publishing, periodicals, and other communication entities. Many of these were wholly owned CIA proprietaries. Others were financed in whole or part by CIA fronts in the foundation world or by CIA-created dummy corporations. Dozens of other organizations active in the international arena also received generous concealed support, while hundreds of individuals in the news and information business became CIA agents or contract employees. By direct ownership and subsidy, by infiltration of financial control, by assigned or edited manuscripts, the CIA channeled information and misinformation to unknowing consumers and ideas. Students, intellectuals, scholars, educators, labor unions, leaders, businessmen, and other molders of opinion were enlisted in the cause or received support from it. From 1953, when Allen Dulles set it in motion, until the mid-1970s, when public exposure somewhat limited its pervasive reach, CIA media operations had spent billions of dollars to propaganda that the word on behalf of policies the U.S. government wished to promote, while UNESCO fought to overcome illiteracy and sponsored conferences on mass communications of peace, disarmament, and vastly fewer dollars to spend. Among prominent assets penetrated or subsidized were the Congress of Cultural Freedom, the National Student Association, the Associated Press, and UPI, United Press International, CBS Time, the Copley Press and Copley News Service, the Rome Daily American, the Foreign News Service, the Forum World Features, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, and Radio Swan beamed their propaganda broadcasts from national frontiers as CIA fronts, a mass communication management of minds William Benton would have admired. According to later revolutions, the CIA never hesitated to manipulate the output of its foreign-based assets, disinformation and black propaganda serving political goals. If there was blowback where the foreign disseminated false material appeared as news in the U.S. press, that was a result the CIA could not control. Yet it was inevitable, since its proprietary foreign news services provided material to numerous media in the United States. More aggressive covert paramilitary operations were also visible to ensure that coups and counter-revolutions, whatever, could not be established by the free flow of information. Almost every president from Truman to Reagan announced a doctrine upholding the right of unilateral intervention to preserve regimes from an unanticipated criminality of defection from the free world. The workings of the State Department. The United States withdrew from UNESCO with numerous criticisms of the latter's administrative failures, as though its own cultural activities had been above such negative interpretation. While an evaluation of the CIA's foray in the cultural field beyond the scope of this work, an analysis of the State Department's cultural relations efforts suggest that the field itself has been often resistant to standards of efficiency and achievement. The United States simultaneously regarded cultural relations as a significant component of its foreign policy and treated it as the ugly stepchild of the State Department's bureaucracy. It was imperial enough to be swept into the foreign policy mainstream because of its considerable stature as an ideologic influence in the contest for men's minds. Yet it never attained recognition for the overall perspective it could give to the formulation and execution of policy. Nor did it ever overcome the traditional service prejudice against it as somehow irrelevant and inconsequential to the main business of diplomacy. In this regard, culture fell into the same neglected category as the United Nations and multilateral affairs generally, time-consuming, bothersome, lacking high visibility and domestic impact, off the main track, the arena in where large efforts produce small results, usually measurable only in the long run. Cultural relations, therefore, tended to be rated by their information or propaganda dimension and were often confused with it. Again, the prestige short-term gains that America didn't see. The primary complaint about the nation's management of education and cultural activities was the failure to see them as essential or to recognize the significant role they could play in international relations. There was a clear, understandable U.S. government policy as to the role of these cultural relations in our national policy, a role described as muddy, complex, cloudy, and fuzzy. The lack of recognition seemed particularly apparent among the State Department's top leadership. Perhaps the country's past experience had not equipped it for world leadership in the cultural arena, but this deficiency had been noted by Benton in the late 1940s and had still not been repaired by the 1960s. The exchange program remained an orphan. In some, Charles Frankel noted, international relations have a technological and scientific setting and an altered political and sociological context, which have pushed educational institutions, scholarly investigations, and the communication of intellectuals across the border to the foreground of international affairs. If these did not receive sustained and forceful support, the government would be igniting the factor which, as much as any, will affect its long-range destiny in the international area. Although cultural relations did not receive the attention as the flower of U.S. foreign affairs, they nonetheless grew and proliferated like weeds. By the 1960s, some 25 government agencies played educational or cultural roles overseas, while another 98 organizations contributed to some aspect of foreign technical or educational services. The State Department's lack of interest in the face of this spreading diversity only heightened the problem of lack of coordination or focus. The relationship between information and communication on the one hand, and education and culture on the other, remained ambiguous. In the propaganda and military battle against the Axis menace, the two components had been administratively united, then co-equal bureaus in the same division, and finally separated in a compromise that left them both in a strangely illogical position to contribute most efficiently and effectively to the government's foreign policy goals. No one seemed satisfied with the original coalition of information and culture, their influence, or the erosion of the latter's integrity by the taint of propaganda. In a 1953 assessment with an eye on McCarthyism, John Foster Dulles created an independent United States information agency, USIA, to strengthen the Cold War anti-communist propaganda campaign against the Soviet Union and detach this psychological activism from state. Culture had been destined for the same separation, but the Senate, led by William Fulbright, insisted the state should retain oversight of this field and that it separated from the onus of shared authority with information. The State Department took back its Educational Cultural Bureau, but all the overseas representatives got assigned to the USIA for administrative oversight and were supervised by the USIA's public affairs, who were trained in mass media and public relations activities. That is to say, propaganda and its immediate impact were the main concerns. Equally odd was the USIA's autonomy from state, since the name of information game was an active promotion of state's foreign policy agenda, while education and culture, with their slow long-term consequences, did not fit into the department's emphasis on dealing with current issues as they arose. Embassy officials looked upon cultural affairs as a footnote to their other responsibilities, while the USIA programs tended to embarrass and compromise the activism undertaken by cultural attaches. AID's larger presence in education and training marched along on its own and did similar programs administered by Labor, the Office of Education, the Children's Bureau, and other units of the federal government. While these problems plagued the coordination and execution of policy, leadership and staffing also diminished the management of cultural affairs. Cultural attaches from the beginning in 1938 have never been well qualified for their positions. Foreign service professionals continue to regard the field as not competitive career interest. Philip Coombs found evidence from cultural affairs did not stimulate the upward advances in the ranks. From 1945 until 1969, not a single official from that division rose to be an ambassador. But can a country not capable of administering and coordinating its own cultural foreign affairs bring vigor, excellence, initiative, and requisite support to its multilateral commitments in the same sphere of interest? UNESCO did not have the U.S. media attention or popular recognition that the UN achieved by its location in New York City. Nevertheless, it did have early advantage of American co-sponsorship, and the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO linked the foreign policy establishment to a network of organizations devoted to implementation of UNESCO's cultural agenda. Initially, therefore, the organization did attract the leaders and talented professionals it deserved at the State Department's UNESCO desk, in the U.S. delegations to UNESCO and to conferences, and in those U.S. nationals recruited to its secretariat. It seemed to have achieved instant status as the fulfillment of liberal cosmopolitans' greatest hopes. Disillusion, however, lay just ahead as UNESCO entered its winter of isolation amid the Cold War ideologies it could not contain. The U.S. National Commission under Milton Eisenhower reluctantly became an instrument of the government's anti-communist national interest, one that approved UNESCO's service only those truly representing an American point of view. The Truman Doctrine's repudiation of compromise with the Soviet Union embarrassed the initial U.S. delegations to a UNESCO that had supported the organization's willing acceptance of all the world's diversity. By 1955, if not sooner, the U.S. National Commission had converted to a Cold War view, although by then the State Department had substantially restricted its input of policy and personnel. Joining the UNESCO team had great liabilities for Foreign Service regulars, and the system inhibited a strong U.S. presence at UNESCO. Any Foreign Service or civil service people picked for UNESCO assignments had to regard their employment there as short-term and inconsequential. Although William Benton had urged the State Department in 1946 to choose top young appointees whose long-term tenure at UNESCO would enhance their influence and experience, the bureaucratic realities dictated otherwise. Under U.S. civil service and foreign service and pension rights of accrual after 3 years, as a result, UNESCO service tended to enlist officials at the end of their careers, or those simply on temporary loan between other more attractive department positions. Critics point to a disarray by 1960, both the United States management of its cultural relations and in general, and in UNESCO relations in particular. After enthusiastic support for UNESCO at the start, Philip Coombs writes, the United States interest dwindled. The efforts to recruit good quality Americans to work for UNESCO were at best spasmodic. The formulation of United States positions on UNESCO matters were largely relegated to people far down in the bureaucratic hierarchy. And in the face of Cold War pressures, the American preference for bilateral action grew steadily bigger. Support for UNESCO had become a minor impact part of the overall purpose of U.S. foreign policy. Delegations to UNESCO's General Conference received inadequate instructions, and the UNESCO issues no longer seemed to be matters of major concern to the State Department. The U.S. National Commission, despite some excellent individuals, did not serve as a coordinating face as originally expected. U.S. government responsibility for all the various activities in the field was not yet centralized and lay scattered among federal agencies and within state. Without strong leadership over policy, cultural attacks overseas languished in an administrative limbo, and long-range purposes remained a low priority. It should have been otherwise. Cultural relations, George Schuster admonished, were now at a stage of development which will require the greatest intelligence and even venturesomeness. It would be the job of the next decade of political leadership under John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson to meet that challenge, to subject cultural relations to some vigorous experimentations. UNESCO's own operations. While the United States struggled to bring coherence to its bilateral and multilateral foreign cultural policies, UNESCO was busy defining its own institutional character and purpose. Its open-ended constitution had to be given operational meaning. The structures of governance had to be made functional, and program objectives had to be assigned priorities. As the conscience of mankind devoted to the search of peace and security, UNESCO still had its mission to do the most practical good in a world starved for all the necessities of knowledge it could dispense. Nor could it avoid the fact, as Richard Hogarth had argued, that almost any question to which UNESCO turns has a political character. UNESCO realized this could not be trapped in what Hogarth has called a technical cordon sanitaire. Concern for ethical dimension of human experience meant it had to consider always the value implications of everything it did. Manipulated by Cold War ideologic imperatives, politicized by anti-communist intrusions into its personal policies, caught up in communications issues serving Western commercial interests, and dominated by the power of the U.S. and oriented Western bloc, UNESCO still fashioned a program of action that fulfilled many of the expectations of its founders. In fact, Assistant Secretary of State Francis Wilcox, in his 1956 congressional testimony, contended that UNESCO's work in fundamental education alone would more than justify its existence. Not controversy, nor tension, nor conflicts of interest absented themselves from the process of development in those days. But they were then regarded not as evidence of UNESCO's incompetence or weakness, but as signs the organization was confronting the most significant problems of its culturally diverse constituency. As an area for the redistribution of scarce resources and the reassessment of international norms, UNESCO's history had always included a continuing effort to balance these competing claims and fashion novel resolutions to them. The problem was not a new one when it came to the attention of the Reagan administration. Inspired and led by 4 director generals between 1946 and 1961, each of whom brought his own special interpretation of the UNESCO idea. The organization established the major themes that were to guide its progress in succeeding decades. In the first place, the founders' idealism continued to sustain commitment to building the defenses of peace by persistent struggles against intolerance, prejudice, racism, and apartheid. As the new nations of Asia and Africa became members, these goals received an impelling urgency, resulting from memories of the former discriminatory colonial subjugation. International understanding always had a proper place at UNESCO's table. Second, and closely connected, the advance and circulation of knowledge remained a high priority, from the fight against world illiteracy to the sharing of nuclear research. This was based on UNESCO's correct assumption that education improved both local and international citizenship and reduced tolerance on others. And finally, that all intellectual endeavor now demanded global cooperation. An equally important objective involved the reduction or elimination of all technical, legal, economic, and political barriers which prevented access to or from the free flow of ideas. The goal, in turn, stimulated the preservation of the world's heritage of ideas and encouraged their interchange to broaden cross-cultural appreciation of the achievements each society had maintained over the ages. All of these had as its premise and maintaining and advancing human rights, since the denial of human dignity had always been the first abuse in the rise of aggressive group behavior everywhere. Ignorance, inequality, and bigoted isolation spawned the mistrust and aggression UNESCO was mandated to reduce, but poverty and backwardness had also taken their toll on the human capacity for mutual understanding and peaceful cooperation. Poor people and poor nations locked into deprivation did not have the time, energy, or resources to engage in the dynamics of civilized intercourse or sustained international reconciliation. UNESCO's peace-building mission, therefore, had to include development assistance and technical support to relieve the intellectual and scientific homelessness in 2/3 of the world. Properly managed, this aid would sustain the integrity and autonomy of the recipients, preserving their cultures from the disruption and devastation of rapid, unthinking, unresponsive modernization by any powerful self-interested agency from the outside. As these purposes became manifest, UNESCO's administrative procedures established themselves. The Director General's importance was crucial in an organization whose centrifugal tendencies each additional member state exaggerated. Centralization of power steadily accompanied both the growth in numbers and the expansion of program responsibilities. The executive board, overseer of policy and function, remained in Western hands until the influx of the third world nations after 1960. It served effectively only when the Western majority remained seriously engaged and reflected the strength of their UNESCO missions and chief delegates. The West had made it a body of government representatives to ensure the security of their own national interests and the expectation of their long-term control of it. In the UNESCO Secretariat, the Anglo-Saxon countries took command of their strategic departments. Budget, personnel, and administration, where the US and the UK held down international spending. The Biennial General Conference approved programs, resolutions, and rules, creating the supervisory legislation prepared by the staff and delegate missions, conferring legitimacy or denial of it to a wide variety of issues and principles. The expressed and idealistic aspirations of UNESCO's multitudes for standards of international conduct most nations had not yet attained, as well as the expressions of emotional anguish over the distribution of the spoils that others had already acquired. The professional skills fueling and directing UNESCO's ambitious plans for world improvement had their source in the staff of the numerous non-governmental organizations. The NGOs represented voluntary non-government associations, independent non-status elements capable of balancing self-serving national political interests, numbering some 400 by 1956. Their presence defined a third force of influence. UNESCO involved its initial programs on a trial and error basis from some 150 projects presented in the first year. Among the notable achievements by 1956 were Arid Zone Research, the Center for European Nuclear Research, the East-West Mutual Appreciation Cultural Studies, the Scientific and Cultural History of Mankind, the Hague Convention to Protect Cultural Policy in War, the Copyright Convention, the reduction of costs and obstacles to the free circulation of educational, scientific, and cultural information, clearinghouse activity, many symposia, seminars, and monographs in the social sciences dealing with racism, nationalism, intolerance, tensions, creating phenomenon, peace and disarmament, participating in the UN program of expanded technical assistance and development programs, Arab refugee aid and training, and numerous projects supporting bibliographic statistical abstracting, museum, library, curricula, scientific and cultural and archaeological preservation centers and services. UNESCO was not without its failures, yet so extensive and manifold were its activities that a New Yorker cartoon visualized it as UNASO, the United Nations A to Z organization. Problems. Despite this considerable record of achievement, UNESCO still found intractable problems that sapped its strength and its original mission. The politicization that surrounded its founding remained an ever-present danger. Nor had UNESCO found itself from manipulations of ideology or superpower rivalries. It had had little success moderating Cold War indifferences or other regional antagonisms, and it had not been able to elevate national commissions to significant levels of political support. National sovereignty had ceded little to international claims, and the UN Assembly, itself politicized and financially distressed, dumped its own insoluble problems on UNESCO for further discussion and actions. Threat of financial revenge by its major donors dramatically limited UNESCO's resources, yet the charges of excessive cost rang a singularly false tone given the evaluation of the spending priorities of the restrictions themselves. The United States, for example, gave General Lucius Clay $16.5 million for German re-education when UNESCO's total budget was $8 million. The Voice of America alone had a $30 million budget. In terms of support for foreign projects, unilateralism won every time. In 1962, Philip Coombs estimated that the United States' own cultural relations efforts in every area received 80 times the UNESCO budget. Just give me 1 second. I'll be right back. Glad you could join us today. Okay, we're going to continue. However, no nation had yet abandoned UNESCO except South Africa, whose departure in 1956 marked its displeasure with the racial priorities of an organization hostile to apartheid. After Stalin's death, the Soviet turned to peaceful coexistence, a doctrine that revived its sense of international participation. East European nations, whose membership had lapsed during the Korean War, rejoined. The People's Republic of China remained an outcast as long as the U.S. pressure controlled membership qualifications on behalf of the Taiwan regime. Regional blocs attained a permanent place in the political maneuvering as a general conference as the membership expanded. Between 1947 and 1954, UNESCO grew from 28 to 73 countries, a figure that included all the former Axis powers, which joined after their re-education. All of this created the rampant pluralism that James Sewell described as UNESCO's essential pattern of influence. How did the United States evaluate the achievements, failures, and changing nature of UNESCO? The Cold War and communication issues had left suspicions about multilateralism and usefulness, and the U.S. posture toward UNESCO was as confused as its attitude toward culture to its own foreign relations. Most of the organization's projects did not reach a level of importance that aroused much interest. As Sewell noted, UNESCO policy areas identified with only a few of the objectives the United States was pursuing intensely, but the Soviet Union and the U.S. were skeptical about issues whose salience was acute for nations of the Third World. In spite of the inroads of anti-communist discontent with UNESCO, Congress remained supportive. A series of congressional hearings in 1953, 1954, and 1956 concluded that the legislative branch was firmly convinced that the United States should continue to give its full and vigorous support to UNESCO, with a cautionary proviso that the country would also more forcibly seek to promote activities and programs which emphasize the concepts of free democratic institutions, particularly in those agencies where such concepts are in conflict with the communist totalitarian ideology. As they listened to UNESCO's expert and professional champions from NGOs and the National Commission, U.S. legislators heard an impressive array of positive testimony, the significant fight against illiteracy, the crucial studies relating education and culture to technical assistance in over 30 countries where free, universal compulsory learning was underway. This support for and utilization of NGOs, the contribution to free flow, freedom of information, and international understanding, and support to the International Council of Scientific Unions and the International Geophysical Year. These statements apparently convinced Congress that UNESCO had a successful first decade. Yet the U.S. vision remained bounded by a narrow definition of accomplishment. UNESCO was judged by the degree to which it helped create free citizens able to maintain free, stable governments and help the U.S. combat Soviet misinformation. If non-aligned nations sought their own destiny outside the parameter of the U.S. model, how would the United States deal with UNESCO's value? And what about American cultural policy if powerful antagonistic pressure groups turned against internationalism in a country where a decade of involvement with UNESCO had made little or no impact in public opinion? Polls indicated the substantial majority of American people were unaware of the organization and its program, so the dynamics of America's relationship with UNESCO stayed constant, a strange, potentially dangerous combination of paradox, ambivalence, contradiction, and thwarted idealism, as T.B. Satyamurthy has characterized them. Conclusion. An uneasy future lay ahead. Eisenhower's rash and counterproductive actions toward the vigorous, broad-based and assertive nationalism throughout the developing world would be bequeathed to both the Kennedy administration and UNESCO in a decade marked by civil rights agitation, national liberation, gender and generational protest, and the Vietnam War. The simplistic answers to world problems that had categorized most issues as Cold War big power conflicts would be inadequate responses to the explosion of national self-determination in the U.S. and abroad. Neither counter pro nor covert of actions could contain these claims to independence and equally though both would make the attempt in all international organizations. The new nationalism would struggle against Western domination, viewed as collective colonialism, and threatened to overrun the constructive channels of change into which the West had so far managed to safely divert it. Preoccupied with their own agenda to identify and development of identity and development, preoccupied with their own agenda of identity and development, the non-aligned countries were willing to accept help from anyone without subscribing to the philosophy of the donor. Aggressive ideological propaganda intended to make them only more non-aligned and more cautious about relevance of Cold War divisions. The United States and its allies, meanwhile, did not adjust well to these unexpected events. Third world grievances were written off as irrelevant. The United States would learn, however, that the containment of communism in the USSR could not be applied to the containment of people protesting the maldistribution of wealth and power. New initiatives would be a requirement of successful international influence in the 1960s and would surely demand something more imaginative than the donning of the green beret. So we're going to be starting again on page 87. That's about 15 pages. So let's make some comments. We started at the covert side. The covert side, there was, nothing, really in the covert side. Then we got to here where we said, by direct ownership and subsidy, by infiltration and financial control, by assigned or edited manuscripts, the CIA channeled information and misinformation to knowing consumers of ideas. Students, intellectuals, scholars, educators, labor union leaders, businessmen, and other molders of opinion were enlisted in the cause or received support from it. From 1953, when Allen Dulles set it in motion, until the mid-1970s, where public exposure somewhat limited its pervasive reach, CIA media operations had spent billions of dollars to propagandize the world on behalf of the policies of the U.S. government wished to promote, while UNESCO fought to overcome illiteracy and sponsored conferences on mass communications and peace and disarmament with vastly fewer dollars to spend. So basically, the U.S. media, this is the giggle session. Remember, this is the giggle session. We get to giggle at the Yankee hypocrisy. The Yankees, hypocrites. They're good-looking con artist Yankees, right? I mean, they like to, call them, nice trim, simple culture of, Yankee whites. And, they're con artists, liars, fabricators, and, charlatan Yankees. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to, laugh a little bit about the Yankees at their expense, because they're, laughable. They're, prestigious, laughable, charlatan Yankees. So we go here, we say that, basically among prominent assets penetrated or subsidized were the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the National Student Association, the Associated Press and the UPI, CBS Time and Copley Press, and Copley News Service, the Rome Daily America, and the Foreign News Service, and Forum World Features, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, and Radio Swan beamed their propaganda broadcasts across national frontiers as CIA fronts, a mass communications management of minds William Benton would have admired. According to later revelations, the CIA never hesitated to manipulate the output of its foreign-based assets, disinformation, and black propaganda, serving political goals. So basically, it's okay, right? You can, basically say just about anything. The mass media, it basically became an outlet for the CIA, right? I mean, the Yankee media, a Time, CBS, AP, Associated Press, and UPI. These are, big prestigious, like AP is, the prestigious Associated Press. It's a Yankee con artist press. It's called the Yankee con artist press. AP, CBS, Time, and Copley Press, Copley News Service, Rome Daily American, Foreign News Service, Forum World Features, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, and Radio Swan. Basically, you can just fraud. They can just commit fraud. They can say anything, anywhere, and it's just fine, right? They wanted UNESCO to follow this kind of, black propaganda. Like I said, they need to be expelled from UNESCO. The U.S. needs to be expelled from UNESCO. They don't belong in this organization. They're not really, with the values of UNESCO. And, we talked about why they are not, worthy of this organization. They are not prestigious enough for UNESCO. So in this regard, culture fell into the same neglected category. We're talking about culture now. Culture fell into the same neglected category as the United Nations and multilateral affairs generally time-consuming, bothersome, lacking high visibility and domestic impact off the main track, an arena where the large efforts produce small results and measurable only in the long run. See, that's that kind of slow sort of requirement to work for slow gains. The Yankee con artists aren't into it, right? You need a quick win. Like a quick win means a quick machine gun down the opponent. And it's a quick win, right? He keeps dogging you and you shoot him in the head and quick, right? It's a quick solution. Don't worry about the dead bodies. And there's no real paperwork when you criminal liar Yankees, right? I mean, when you got your press to be con artist Yankees, so that it's fine, right? So that's how they do it. Anything on culture, they found it bothersome, time-consuming, lacking high visibility and domestic impact off the main track. So this is a cultural organization, UNESCO, United States Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. But culture to the Yankees was, stupid, right? The typical thing, the Yankees think culture is stupid, right? So let's keep going. The State Department took back its Educational Cultural Bureau, but all the overseas representatives got assigned to the USIA for administrative oversight and were supervised by the USIA's public affairs officers who were trained in mass media and public relations activities. That is to say, propaganda and its immediate impact were their main concern. So, basically, the Educational Cultural Bureau was meant to spew out, anti-third world propaganda. That's the Yankees' approach to culture and education is, education and culture is simply to, propaganda. Everything is propaganda, the Yankees. If you have education and you have a book, you need to put it in the form of propaganda. One that, promotes the American Yankee, con artist, and one that demeans the goals of the organization, like UNESCO. And that's what they did here. This United, the Education and Cultural Bureau was completely a fraudulent Yankee organization. So, while these problems plague the coordination and execution of policy leadership and staffing also diminished the management of cultural affairs, cultural attachés from the beginning of 1938 have never been well qualified for their positions. Foreign service professionals continue to regard the field as not a competitive career interest. So, the Yankees are just not interested in culture. The problem is the Yankees are in organizations. They join organizations like, the Cabbage Patch. They, it would be nice, prestigious to have a nice, sweet-looking Cabbage Patch, like a 3-year-old girl or a 2-year-old boy is, how the immature Yankee, con artists behave. And, they join the organization and, the culture, why do we need to have culture, right? You're a member of UNESCO, right? United Nations Education, Cultural, and Scientific Organization. So you should, think about culture, right? I mean, you may not think culture is important, but other people think it is. So Yankee, you have to, join the club, right? I mean, you can't just, be in your own, Yankee con artist, right? You can't just, machine gun the other culture, right? I mean, you can't just, have that. That's not the world works, and that's why the Yankees are, Yankee con artists. So continuing on, we got one more. But can a country not capable of administering and coordinating its own cultural foreign relations bring vigor, excellence, initiative, and requisite support to its multilateral commitments in the same sphere of interest? UNESCO did not have the U.S. media attention of popular recognition that the UN achieved by its location in New York City. Nevertheless, it did have the early advantage of American co-sponsorship, and the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO linked the foreign policy establishment to a network of organizations devoted to the implementation of UNESCO's cultural agenda. So, basically, the UN, it's in New York, so they're, good with the UN. It's a puppet of the Yankees, con artists, liars. But, the UNESCO is not in New York, right? So, we don't care about bringing vigor, excellence, initiative, and requisite support, right? You don't have cultural foreign relations, Yankee. So, why are you in the organization? Again, you need to be expelled. The Yankees need to be expelled. Another example is that because they don't have the ideology of the organization. They're not into it. It's a group of Yankee con artists. They join things, like hysteria. They're nativist hysterians. Oh, it would be so cool to be a member member of UNESCO, right? We dropped out 37 years ago, but now we can just, join the club and be like, a pro third worlder, and then just, shoot the Iranians, murder Maduro, Venezuela Maduro, destroy Cuba, and nobody will say a thing, right? We're, a member, card-carrying member, a good-looking card-carrying, cultural, simple culture American member, Yankee, member of, UNESCO. That's why they're, frauds. It's a group of con artists, frauds. They're Yankee, rapist, butcher, con artist, liar, Yankees. So that's that. So we talked about that. And then we got finally to, basically the executive board, overseer policy and function remained in Western hands until the influx of third world nations after 1960. It served effectively only when the Western majority remained seriously engaged and reflected the strength of their UNESCO missions and their chief delegates. The West had made it a government representative to ensure the security of their own national interests and the expectation of their long-term control of it. So this is actually, all of the West, right? Basically, the executive board was in Western hands. And, it was until the influx of third world nations after 1960. So the board before 1960 was in Western hands. And they made it a tool of national interest. But once the West, lost their, monopoly of the voting, privilege, the third world joined the organization. Then the Yankees said, no, right? I mean, majority vote and stuff. Each black guy has a vote. Are you, sick? I mean, Asians get a vote, like an equal vote with our, Yankee good-looking, trim whites, right? Our Yankee whites are equal vote for Asians. And Hispanics get a vote. What are you, crazy? I mean, Hispanics don't deserve a vote. That's the Yankee approach. They couldn't take, equal voting. So again, they need to be expelled from UNESCO. It's pretty straightforward. They're Yankee fraud con artists. So continuing on, as they listened to UNESCO's expert and professional champions from the NGOs and the National Commission, U.S. legislature heard an impressive array of positive testimony, the significant fight against illiteracy, the crucial studies relating education and culture to technical assistance in over 30 countries where free universal compulsory learning were underway, the support for and utilization of NGOs, the contribution to free flow, freedom of information, and international understanding and support for the International Council of Scientific Unions and the International Geophysical Year. These statements apparently convinced Congress that UNESCO had a successful first decade, but they didn't stay in it, right? I mean, they just, basically these are the goals of the organization. These are the correct goals of the organization: literacy, compulsory learning, education and culture, freedom of information, international understanding of people, peaceful resolution of disputes internationally. These are not American goals. These are not Yankee goals. The Yankees are, violent white Yankee ideology is how you resolve disputes. You just pull up a machine gun. It's a Yankee machine gun, con artist, liar, Yankee, rapist, butcher, Yankees. So they resolve disputes that way. They're not into this kind of, resolution of disputes. And what about American cultural policy if powerful antagonist pressure groups turned against internationalism in a country where a decade of involvement with UNESCO had made little or no impact of public opinion? If non-aligned nations sought their own destiny outside the parameter of the U.S. model, how would the United States deal with UNESCO's values? So obviously it's not good, right? The U.S. could not deal with non-aligned nations thinking of UNESCO as its own model, right? And polls indicated that the substantial majority of the American people were unaware of the organization and its programs. So basically, the dynamic of America's relationship with UNESCO stayed constant, a strange, potentially dangerous combination of paradox, ambivalence, contradiction, and thwarted idealism. So basically, the American people, they weren't into UNESCO, right? They were not aware of it. They don't really care, right? I mean, culture to the American people is, Yankee, suit, Armani, right? An Armani suit. That's the Yankee culture, nice, good looking, like light skin, like silky skin Yankees. That's the way the Yankees think. They don't have anything about, human being, right? I mean, human imperfection and stuff to them is, worthy of, the pistol, right? And that's how they resolve dispute. I have a dispute with your mole on your face, you black man. And, there it goes. It's done. There's, the mole is gone and so is the man, right? That's the Yankee approach to, culture and, public opinion, organization, and UNESCO. So, like we said, America needs to be expelled from UNESCO. That's pretty clear. I mean, if they're not, they're Yankee con artists. That's basically it. So let's continue. Challenge and change confront Cold War concepts, the 1960s. Conceived as post-war idealism, UNESCO found itself quickly succumbing to the imperative of Cold War anti-communism during its initial phase of operational life. Liberal hopes locked into Western patterns envisioned the universal potential of the UN system as a way to reproduce their values and attitudes around the world. But UNESCO also developed a mind of its own, maltreated and ignored and great power rivalry. UNESCO and its third world adherents entered the 1960s with plans and objectives that would redefine the terms of coexistence set forth by the Western powers. The U.S., by the same token, had become aware that its ideologic game plan failed to address the most issues of significance to the less developed countries, and that something had to be done or an explosion might result. As the mythology of peace had exalted the post-war yearning for international cooperation, the folklore of development sanctified the subsequent collaboration of the 1960s. Both presented themselves as symbols of a new dedication to the common cause of international progress and human betterment, while blinding their followers of self-serving realization. Building the defenses of peace had turned into a mass communications nightmare of nationalistic propaganda, aided and abetted by free market principles. Development was to have an equally ambiguous career beneath its veneer of charitable assistance. As Dennis Goulot observed, the seemingly objective program of welfare modernization represented as well the attacks of a technoculture which disdains the recipient's most cherished self-images as puerile and obsolete. Development could betray as well as fulfill the hopes of the third world, just as the mass media had done in the 1950s, and in each case, UNESCO had the same role to play, evaluating the quality and content of the proposed program of relief and restoration and trying to hold it accountable for its intended beneficiaries. The issue in both decades was local control and local access of the decision-making process. That is, who would manage the world's information and development systems and in whose interests. On President Kennedy and new cultural relations. As the paradigm of UNESCO's mission shifted, so too did the United States model of foreign cultural relations. In a similar resurgence of idealism, the Kennedy administration attempted to reinvent the entire format by which the American people themselves understood abroad, learned from others, and thereby came to know themselves better. In typical Kennedy style, the heavy think tank battalions led a blitzkrieg of change against a well-defended institutional bureaucracy. The momentum carried through Lyndon Johnson's term of office, but met strong resistance from the State Department, the Congress, and the lobbies of popular patriotic paranoia. However well-intentioned the effort, the Democratic presidencies lost their possibilities of achievement in the morass of Vietnam. As so often has happened in American history, war aborted reform. Cultural relations and UNESCO association remained unfinished business to be settled by later administrations less interested in these dimensions of foreign policy. The United States, UNESCO, and the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO all believe in the early 1960s that they were entering a new era of hope and achievement that would reflect the contributions each had to make to the welfare and security of the world. And they anticipated undertaking this vast project with the immense cultural consequences together. Soon after taking office, John F. Kennedy remarked that the whole field of education and culture needed imaginative policy directions, unification, and vigorous direction when he became the first president to invite a UNESCO Director General, Rene Malraux, to a White House meeting. A symbolic gesture seemed to signify his government's commitment to international organizations. Responsive to the American initiative and sensing its own revival as 17 new African states became members, UNESCO leaders believed they were witnessing the torch being passed to a new generation. When James Sewell described the history of this period, he entitled his chapter Regeneration. The U.S. National Commission also seemed to sense the newly developed stature of the international agency and its dynamic abilities to function well. No skepticism now existed about UNESCO's work and necessity. UNSC stated, and the Commission anticipated that a resurgence of its power and influence would follow. As 1961 began, the old idealism had returned. It seemed almost like 1946 again, but this time the goal appeared less elusive. Development carried such practical, technical connotations that its subversion by ideology and politics could not yet be imagined in that early enthusiasm. Under John F. Kennedy, the U.S. government was apparently ready to accept the existence of emerging nations of the third world and to readjust somewhat its foreign policy toward a dialogue with them. When his close advisor Averell Harriman asked, "What course do we want events to take?" Kennedy responded by determining to manage history and somehow find the power and resources to do so. His was a policy-producing administration, and its break with the past, the most noticeable in those programs, that signified an orientation to the third world nationalism that Eisenhower had largely neglected. Kennedy's commitment to UN organizations that were responding to the less developed world substantiated his willingness to play a strong international as well as bilateral role in the formulation of a better global community. In the early 1961 address, the new president called for a UN decade of development in which UNESCO would have a large contributory role to play. Kennedy gave international bilateral backing by creating the Agency for International Development Aid, the Alliance for Progress, the Peace Corps, and the Food for Peace program, all of them designed in one sense to stimulate and serve the national development needs of the third world countries. However, as we shall see, all of these programs had another side, a commitment to the assumption and priorities of the Western capitalist notion of democracy. Utopian rhetoric marked by frenzied enthusiasm, similar to that which had accompanied UNESCO's founding, had characterized the plunge into a development syndrome. Wearied of the monolithic anti-communist abstraction of the Eisenhower Dulles approach, with its dogmatic dismissal of neutralism as treason against the free world, the Kennedy intellectuals prepared to disengage America from Cold War crusades steeped in militarism and to recognize the post-colonial world as the pluralist, autonomous ally it could be. The compelling catchwords of freedom and diversity once more echoed from academic halls and State Department corridors. In May 1961, Dean Rusk told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, "We seek above all the world of free choice in which great diversity of nations, each faithful to its own traditions and its own genius, will learn to respect the ground rules of human survival. We do not wish to make the world over in our own image, and we will not accept the world be made over in the image of any society or dogmatic creed. Against the world of coercion, we affirm the world of choice." The ideology of self-determination, albeit with substantial reservation, received additional encouragement in a subsequent presidential speech at Berkeley, California. Kennedy proclaimed his country's alignment with the profound tendencies of history that were moving the world toward pluralism and national variety in an irreversible trend toward independence. The U.S. and those new revolutions could proceed together within a framework of international cooperation where every country can solve its own problems according to its own traditions and ideals. At this USIA, Edward Murrow had similar ideological hopes for a new future in which his information services would explain the American role in a diverse and evolving world instead of expounding free enterprise propaganda. In Foreign Affairs, John Kenneth Galbraith emphasized that the critical necessities of the nation's development included sizable educational improvements, increased social justice, responsible administration, and a purposeful theory of national planning. UNESCO possibly could lead in the training and enlightenment of the human resources sector of that economic modernization. All in all, the Kennedy administration responded to the revolution of rising expectations by a commitment to closing the economic gap between the North and South. Since the president admitted that 6% of the world's population cannot impose our will upon the other 94%, reducing that gap would have to be a process of mutual and equitable negotiation. Failure to address the issue or resolve the maldistribution of wealth and power would just as clearly turn rising expectations into, in Arthur Schlesinger's words, a revolution for raging envies. Rhetoric and reality, some contradictory tendencies. hypocrisy, the typical hypocrisy. Some hidden profound tendencies in history did not, however, support the self-assured, even glib theorizing of the Harvard MIT brain trust, which inspired this rhetoric of free choice and autonomous development. A closer examination of its context, for example, reveals one major reservation: the ever-present anti-communism, a qualification Secretary of State Rusk made with his usual terse frankness. The United States would still oppose any tendency for the Third World to be made over in the image of any society or dogmatic creed. The choice Rusk offered was really no choice at all. Although Kennedy's Berkeley speech condemned the monolithic model the communists offered the world, the freedom of choice in the American design simply assumed the process of democratic reform would be elected. Accordingly, he pledged U.S. military support for such systems of development against disruptions and interventions. Although Kennedy's theoreticians defined the dynamics of modernization in much more comprehensive terms than the limited technical assistance that had dominated U.S. foreign aid since Truman's Point 4 program, they did not always foresee the cultural complexities that could inhibit such schemes of social restoration. While recognizing the potential for explosiveness in altering entire social structures and ways of thought and life, and in changing men's minds, they did not describe the political and cultural policies that would actually have to accompany the aid to make it, as Frankel urged, culturally penetrative and acceptable in those experiencing it. Nor did they guarantee that either the State Department's Educational and Cultural Relations Office or the American Mission to UNESCO had the resources, staff, and office and time to manage and export the modernization in the appropriate context. There was not even an assurance that Congress was prepared to go along. Was there the national discernment and creativity, as Dennis Goulet put it, to bring this about? He doubted it. Can the increased opportunity for a full life be conveyed from an industrialized source as a crisis of personal and collective unfulfillment? The odds were against it, since in spite of their impressive technological supremacy, the developed nations have in the main failed to bring wisdom to their social structures and human relationships. What the Kennedy think tankers had not yet realized was the idea of balance and equal exchange in all cultural relationships, the same concepts that had once bedeviled the mass communications debate and would do so again. Frankel's analysis predicted the failure of aid if it remained project-oriented and did not explore the political, ethical, and anthropological context in a two-way educational dialogue. Only if two moral systems spoke to each other in a continuing exchange would the aid work. Unless the development aid had, therefore, a high-level commitment to advancing educational objectives first and foremost, the intended beneficiaries would likely to see it as cultural aggression, witting or unwitting. In that case, those perceptions would sooner or later emerge in the commerce of international debate, scorning the hands that aided it and demanding a more equitable, culturally respectful order of things in the future. Another profound historical tendency inhibiting the development decade was America's own tradition of foreign aid. Like mass communications, it combined the principles of benevolence to others with a free self-serving commercial advantage decked out in a free market doctrine and accentuated by anti-communism. More often, it supported short-term national political goals and military ends rather than the long-term benefits accruing to the supposed beneficiaries. As one U.S. expert explained, it is likewise, I believe, the right of general capital exporting nation, always adhering to the principles of the UN Charter, to parallel in its external activities the pattern of its internal economy. The rhetoric of international assistance duplicated a defense to the mass media's global supremacy, as it called upon the World Bank to promote the free flow of privileged capital by the removal of all obstacles to it. The elimination of all deterrents to the free flow of private capital by the International Agency of Finance would thereby renew the lush economic growth of another day, preaching free trade and an open door abroad while practicing restrictive economic policies of advantage to its own industry and agricultures. America's development aid package would generally not be likely to escape the restraints a powerful free enterprise economy would demand. Modifications of foreign aid concepts. as the Kennedy planners modified the priorities in foreign aid. Moreover, its impact induced greater national hysteria and economic damage than its less intrusive, more haphazard experiments of the Eisenhower era. It required a more extensive educational and cultural apparatus to attain viable patterns of growth. Memories of UNRRA and Marshall Plan successes proved deceptive, since their achievements had restored pre-existing industrial economies and had helped by grants rather than loans. Truman's Point 4 inaugurated a decade of spasmodic technical assistance, key to defend against Soviet intervention, narrowly focused on the export of American know-how and increasingly military in nature and political in purpose. It had, by 1960 to 61, become primarily short-term backup to friendly governments and defense-related materials, and had little to do with the instigation of self-sustained growth or with the support of nationally conceived endogenous economic expansion. Chaotically administered, intellectual, and fragmented, the aid program experienced 4 organizational transformations and 8 directors during Eisenhower's 2 terms in office. The Kennedys viewed it as a deformed relic of Cold War and were determined to change it. Intimidations of reform had already surfaced in the late Eisenhower years, making the long-term aid segment to the total assistance program more effective, enhancing the United States' position in third world economies, increasing the low-cost access to foreign raw materials, and improving the U.S. export of industrial and agricultural products, all motivated the shift toward reform. The toll of Cold War expenditures also played a role, especially in the turn of greater multilateral involvement by UN agencies responsive to U.S. influence and policies. And as the U.S. balance of payments became increasingly unfavorable, in part owing to common market competition, this served additional pressure for change. The United States was finding its international aid obligations more burdensome and desired to ease its financial strain and payments deficit through multilateral programs that spread the responsibilities among other nations. In late 1950s, thus produced the World Bank's International Finance Corporation, 1957, the UN Special Funds, 1959, and the International Development Association, 1960, while the United States created the Development Loan Fund, 1958, and the Inter-American Development Bank, 1960. All these ventures had the mission that supported U.S. foreign economic policy objectives by the demonstration effect of its loans. The IPC would stimulate the free flow of private investment capital by proving development loans could be highly profitable. The IDA and the Special Fund would build infrastructures, whether revenue producing or not, and train people and services that would create an opportunity atmosphere for both private and public investment. In gaining public recognition and value, IDA's proponents stressed its value in meeting the Soviet economic offensive, as well as involving a wider community of lenders in that operation. Obviously, the free flow of private capital in its search for highly profitable returns did not venture forth to spur less developed countries economically forward without the international groundwork of preparation beforehand. Economic free flow, like information free flow, moved in one-way channels designed to maintain established systems of power. The result, according to James Sewell, often exaggerated the problems of development rather than solving them, and tended to engender, in the non-recognition of the local context, continuing conflict among those involved rather than habituation and agreement. The LDCs remained dissatisfied with free flow as such. Private investment would have to return, besides profits to the lender, higher per capita real income, a higher standard of living, justice, and economic independence. The self-sustained growth of the Agency for International Development made it look like a third world country receiving bilateral aid. While it brought under one roof Eisenhower's disparate collective assistance, it could not disentangle itself from the prior subservience to the military assistance of anti-communism. If it was more unified than the theoretically pure, a suspicious Congress and the consequent political appeasement of its fervent right-wing coalition kept its purposes and the resources narrowly circumscribed. Congressman Otto Passman, chair of the Foreign Aid Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee, still derided the spenders, the dreamers, the internationalists, while Senator Bork Hickenlooper put through the 1962 law requiring aid to be cut off to nations expropriating corporate property without prompt, adequate, and effective compensation. In his survey of aid's early years, Arthur Schlesinger described it as sluggish, and ineffectual during a time of turmoil and frustration. At the end of a decade of interpretation was even more dismal, but from a third world point of view. The development boom, whether bi or multilateral, and however intentioned, was always a boomerang, returning substantial benefits to the donors who preferred to call them byproducts of their foreign aid programs. In Eugene Black's description of developmental diplomacy, aid served the national economic interest by the promise of or threat of its presence or absence, and by terms of self-enrichment attached to the bounty it distributed. Not intended to make friends, as John Foster Dulles affirmed, foreign assistance looked out for the interest of the United States. Its open markets aided exports, stimulated investment, and provided low-cost raw materials and essential minerals. In Percy Bidwell's succinct summary, it also ensured that neither nationalistic policies nor communist influence deny American industries access on reasonable terms to the basic materials necessary to the continued growth of the American economy. The aid development loans, not grants, for example, required repayment in dollars, earnable by selling commodities whose price level and stability had the U.S. controlled by its opposition to producer agreements. Tied loans also forced the recipients to spend the money for U.S. exports. Import quotas and tariff preference barriers further limited the power of less developed countries, while the $3 billion annual subsidies to American farmers expanded their access to foreign markets. Debt service, meanwhile, confirmed the stagnation implicit in unequal bargaining power and resources. The mounting third world debt was to become perhaps the most compelling problem in the late 1980s. The disparity of outlook began appearing at the United Nations conferences on trade and development in 1964 and 1968, where the U.S. opposed most third world demands. A development policy combating aid pressure and exclusion had the LDCs wondering whether they had been delivered from Cold War ideologies only to be unlucky participants in the ruthless realities of free market capitalism, where political interventions favoring the powerful lay hidden in the automatic processes that market proclaimed. UNESCO and Kennedy initiatives. UNESCO took the Kennedy initiatives at face value, just as it had done with the preamble to its constitution. It could hardly do otherwise. Declarations of high purpose had been its inspiration in translating them into effective programs, the cross it had always borne. American blacks had used the 14th Amendment in much the same way, slowly moving its constitutional impact from corporate protector to foe of inequality and state-sanctioned aggregation. UNESCO also realized it had an obligation to act, since the development process was bound to be a transforming and massive educational and cultural experience for most of its members, whether UNESCO participated or not. Minds would certainly be effective regardless of motive. They might still be somewhat prepared by this small and deliberate attempt the organization could make to build defenses against the unequal onslaught of change. Nor could UNESCO neglect its role as a parliamentary forum for the less powerful to influence the international climate of opinion and propose alternative values for consideration there. It had always served a symbolic purpose, one that Americans had taken full advantage of in their own propagandizing of global attitudes from 1946 on. Since the United States still retained extraordinary influence even when uninterested or unaffected by multilateral affairs, UNESCO may even have hoped to turn developmental enthusiasm into formal U.S. overall support, just as mass communications once had done. And the diversion of development must have come as a relief for the rigid Cold War preoccupations characterizing so much of UNESCO's experience. However, the new U.S. development program did not necessarily suit UNESCO's original mission, dispel inner agreements about its priorities, or eliminate the politicizations that had so long characterized its pursuit of peace. It could be argued that promoting development was a form of peace building on the premise that rising standards of literacy and living inculcated capacity to understand others and become more powerful as a result. And if economic growth occurred, the population might then have the self-confidence, resources, and identity to pursue mutual international affairs as equals. The proponents of intellectual cooperation in UNESCO focused on a high-level professional interaction, were less enthusiastic, and regarded the practical projects as somewhat tawdry digression from the educational and cultural exchanges, seminars, and conferences that flavored their academic life. Development, like the concept of peace, had a limitless frontier need, and as UNESCO's membership steadily enlarged, the expanding demands for relief vastly complicated the equitable assignment of priorities. The task expansionists included both the NGOs that received subvention funding and the LDCs. The process of block and individual bargaining, log rolling, and horse trading thus became characteristic of project formulation. The threat of centrifugal disaster and budgetary inflation now loomed over larger, held in bounds by the centralizing power of a strong director general and the fiscal discipline of the 11 or so restrictionist nations, mostly Western, but including the Soviet Union, that dominated finance by the size of their assessments. As a fact of third world life, development inevitably spawned politicization, but that was not limited to the program and budget alone. The real political issue involved differing interpretations of development among UNESCO's members. The United States and its industrial allies believed it to be a technical, non-political dimension of the organization's good works agenda. UNESCO would be responsible for sustaining and improving the infrastructure once maintained by the colonial regimes. In that view, the attention to the economic modernization reduced the possible intrusions of contentious political issues into UNESCO's arena. Even if the United States lost its voting majority, therefore, the organization's programs would still enhance the patterns of development the nation was pursuing by bilateral relations with its influence at the U.S. agencies such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the GATT. If the structure of power failed, the rich countries could conduct their own economic planning in smaller units and control, like the OECD and the Group of 10. UNESCO's own perspective. The Third World UNESCO Director General, René Mahou, had an alternative perspective that envisioned less technical goal and sought, in the process of development, some redistribution of the world's wealth and power. At the very least, these UNESCO voices resisted being overwhelmed by the technocratic avalanche the separately financed United Nations development programs funding might unleash. External financing and support for UN-organized development projects by voluntary contributions endangered UNESCO's independence and enhanced the control of development assistance by the industrialized North. Development theory by Third World adherents stirred politically sensitive dreams of more equitable international economic order. As the newly liberated nations emerged and formed alliances in their common impoverishment, they recognized the connection between economic backwardness and exploitation and communications stagnation. The reformation of global economic relations demanded access to information resources. LDCs needed media power to cement their own mutual allegiance, to take action as a united movement. They would not be able to influence the center of world economic power until they had first promoted a greater interchange of ideas among themselves, and that meant freeing themselves from the communications captivity to the Western media. Since these media did not provide the coverage promoting information flow among the non-aligned, or much not care not to do so, the LDCs would obviously have to create their own. Only later would they fight the battle over the serious imbalances in world information power that diminished their ability to wage convincing attacks on the hostile economic environment they wished to change. To the West's surprise, therefore, development led to the idea of a new international economic order and, in turn, to the world information and communications order. The decade of development triggered rising expectations the U.S. had not expected. The UNESCO Development Mission had its origins in the post-war U.S. and UN responses to world economic conditions that might foster international anarchy, especially in the U.S. view, if manipulated by communist intervention. In the 1949.4 program and in the 1950 UN expanded program of technical assistance, UNESCO added an educational and training component, but that area remained small during the decade of the 1950s. With the UN Special Funds, 1959, the World Bank's IDA, 1961, and the UNICEF decision to support education, UNESCO greatly enlarged its funding and functioning in education for development. It assisted governments to generate proposals for special fund support, served as an experimental laboratory for the assessment of the educational ideas, and fought energetically to reduce the 700 million illiterates in the world community. In educational planning, teacher training, and institution building, UNESCO's activity, according to historians, were salient, effective, professional, and non-political. Once UNESCO had been attacked as not relevant to the real world for its failure to enlist in Cold War ideologic battles, In the 60s, this relevance to the real world could not be doubted. Responding to the development of human resources as a precondition of economic progress, UNESCO broadened its involvement, thereby stimulating opportunity and achievement in education, science, and mass communications. A convention against discrimination in education in 1960 helped open the field to a wider participation. The United States did not sign it. Renee Howe attended the first UN conference on science and technology in 1963 and made UNESCO a key player in imagining the applications of science in enhancing and facilitating growth, something the non-aligned movement members were quick to understand. Thereafter, UNESCO took initiatives and planned studies in hydrology, oceanography, geology, and seismology, man and the environment, land use, and conservation. All this culminated in 1970 Man in the Biosphere program with projects all over the world. Not only did this activity imply a commitment to planetary management that preserved resources still undeveloped for future generations, but it also distributed the subsequent scientific knowledge as a giant information bank for the benefit of those countries where such exchanges otherwise would not have occurred. A computerized scientific statistical system called UNICIST, for example, developed between 1967 and 1971, collected and circulated by the scientific information, bibliographies, and abstracts. By the early 1970s, UNESCO was supporting development in 119 countries and had 317 large-scale projects underway and an additional 65 teacher training programs. It had also provided $81 million in technical assistance to the engineering colleges or institutes during the 1960s. In India, an experimental satellite-assisted education program was beaming instruction to 5,000 villages, encouraging learning and access to the tools of knowledge. UNESCO remained a symbol of hope for the third world nations, trying to mobilize their human resources and escape from an underdeveloped past. Other UNESCO activities supported cultural pride, preservation, and understanding on the theory that a sense of dignity and autonomy is also an essential ingredient of the national well-being and should accompany development. Social science research and publications examine the internal cultural dynamics that affected modernization. Population and family planning studies provided crucial information on their linkage to economic growth. Comparative cross-cultural studies and projects, such as the publication of the multi-volume History of Africa, stimulated the recognition and diffusion of national racial achievements. At the same time, the visible outstanding examples of those historical contributions of those historical contributions to the world aesthetic, the betterment, came under UNESCO's protection, saving the Abu Simbel and other Nubian monuments from the waters to be stored behind the Aswan Dam, represented the most vernacular of these rescue efforts. Other such initiatives followed in Venice, Indonesia, Cambodia, and Florence after its 1966 floods, and the program received worldwide authority in the 1972 Convention for the Protection of the World Cultural and National Heritage, which listed important sites in the United States as well, although the U.S. had not signed yet as of late 1973. These continued a preservation mandate that had already produced the 1954 Convention for the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, to which the U.S. is not a party. UNESCO also sponsored research on the techniques of conservation and restoration at some 10 regional centers that had dispatched 250 experts to 64 countries to help rehabilitate various cultural sites and monuments. As Julian Burstock concluded, these achievements demonstrated UNESCO's capacity to perform the valuable work foreseen for it in the Constitution. So that's it. We did, basically 25 pages on the dot. We didn't, go longer. So we're going to just, start, our review. This is the giggle session. Remember, this is the giggle session. Giggle, because this gets you giggle about, American Yankee prestige, right? We can giggle about, how they have this prestige, when they're rapist, butcher, Yankee, con artists, right? So let's, get started. The U.S., by the same token, had become aware that its ideologic game plan failed to address most issues of significance to the less developed countries, and that something had to be done or an explosion might result. So basically, the ideologic game plan, the Yankee ideologic game plan is, the third world, has to, follow nativism, right? White supremacy and nativism. That's the Yankee forecast or formula for United Nations, educational, scientific, and cultural organization success. So that's their, issue, and their, Yankee, con artists. It's a group of Yankee con artists, racist Yankee white con artists. Okay, so Utopian rhetoric marked by frenzied enthusiasm, similar to that which had accompanied UNESCO's founding, against characterized the plunge into a development syndrome. Wearied of the monolithic anti-communist abstraction by the Eisenhower Dulles approach, with its dogmatic dismissal of neutralism as treason against the free world, the Kennedy intellectuals prepared to disengage America from Cold War crusades steeped in militarism and to recognize the post-colonial world as the pluralist autonomous ally. Okay, utopian rhetoric marked by frenzied enthusiasm, similar to which had accompanied UNESCO's founding, again characterized the plunge into a development syndrome. So, utopian, that means, like just, imaginary, fictional, right? Kennedy's fictional rhetoric, frenzied enthusiasm that we're, going to reform and we're going to not be so militaristic. What happened, Yankee? I mean, that's obviously you didn't follow that, somehow, gun violence, murders and, Hispaniola and all the South American, Latin American nations happened. So, all of the rhetoric, utopian rhetoric is what we best describe Yankee, fraud, con artist, statements. Rhetoric and reality, some contradictory tendencies. So some hidden profound tendencies of history did not, however, suppress the self-assured, even glib theorizing of the Harvard MIT brain trust, which inspired this rhetoric of free choice in autonomous development. So this is, the MIT Harvard brain trust, right? The brain trust, the Yankee con artists at Harvard and MIT, they're Yankee academia con artists. We're reviewing the Professor Yankee, frauds of, Yankee imperialism, right? The third world, pro-third world imperialist, butcher rapist Yankees, right? So a closer examination of this context, for example, reveals one major reservation, the ever-present anti-communism. A qualification Secretary of State Russ made with his usual frank terseness. The United States would still oppose any tendency for the third world to be made over the image of any society of dogmatic creed. So basically, dogmatic creed, you understand what Mr. Rusk said and his Harvard MIT brain trust, backed up is dogmatic creed. That means white man is, in charge of the cash, right? That's a Yankee, dogmatic creed. So if, anything that goes against the third world, right? Any tendency for the third world to go against the dogmatic creed that the white Yankee or the white man, white man supremacist controls the cash. That's, Rusk's and Harvard MIT academia's Yankee fraud statement. With these kinds of values, the Yankees need to be kicked out of UNESCO. I mean, it's not a rational thing. They need to just be booted from UNESCO. It needs the boot. They need the boot. They're, Yankee con artists. They joined this organization as con artist Yankees. So continuing on. So we said, basically, the odds were against it, since in spite of their impressive technological supremacy, the developed nations have in the main failed to bring wisdom to their social structures and human relationships. So, basically, even though the educational cultural relations offices and the staff and message of experts were all, part of their, propaganda or their, policy statements, the fact that they're basically, even though they were impressively technologically supreme, the developed nations in the main had failed to bring wisdom to their social structures and human relationships. Basically, they don't know how to talk to, non-whites. I mean, basically what he's saying is that, even though they have these, big, complex Yankee formulations of policy, they don't even know how to talk to non-Yankees, right? I mean, the Yankees talk to non-Yankees, with, either ideology, you follow us, or, we shoot you when we get prestige because it's an easy win, right? An easy silence. That's the Yankees, the Yankee, rapist, butcher, fraud, con artist, Yankees. So going on, if two moral systems spoke to each other in continuing exchange, would the aid work? Okay, so we're talking about the aid debate. The mass communications debate. Frankel's analysis predicted that failure of aid, if it remained project-oriented, it did not explore the political, ethical, and anthropological context in a two-way educational dialogue. Only if two moral systems spoke to each other in a continuing exchange would the aid work. So it means that if the Yankees want to give aid, the Yankees can't, put an ideology price on it, right? You can only have aid if you follow Yankee imperialism, right? If you, grab your machine gun, military and, make sure the people, are kept in check, right? Any, democratic viewpoints for, nationalism, for the non-white man, for the, the Asian, African, and Hispanic, That's a no-no. That's a no-no. The Yankees, get very violent when, by any chance of imagination, talk about, liberation and stuff. Those words are, sin in the English language for the Yankees. They're right, the Yankee con artist. So that's, what that means. Basically, the moral communication has to be equal. Like everybody has to talk on the same moral framework, not the Yankees, white, ideology of violent white Yankees versus, everybody else. More often it's supported short-term national political goals and military ends rather than the long-term benefits accruing to the supposed beneficiaries. As one U.S. expert explained, it is likewise, I believe, the right of a great capital exporting nation, always adhering to the principles of the UN Charter, to parallel its external activities, the pattern of internal economy. The rhetoric of international assistance duplicated a defense of the mass media's global supremacy as it called upon the World Bank to promote the free flow of private capital by the removal of all obstacles to it. So that's the press, the mass media's global supremacy, the Yankee mass media's global supremacy invoked the World Bank, right? The indebtor of the third world people, the one that kept the Brazilians in a state of poverty, the Indonesians, the Chileans in a state of poverty, right? Keeping Pinochet in power, slaughtering hundreds and thousands of people, 3 million people in some places. This is the Yankee, con artist press. Their press is, a bunch of con artist Yankee, distorters, fabricators, global supremacy. Mass media, Yankee media's global supremacy. They're global frauds. They're global con artists, Yankees. Okay, that's what that means. Preaching free trade and an open door abroad while practicing restrictive economic policies of advantage to its own industry and agriculture, America's development aid package would not be likely to escape the restraints of a powerful free enterprise economy would demand. So basically, you can't, propagandize and preach free trade and open door abroad and then restrictive, economic policies in your own industries, right? You won't, hire non-whites. You'll just, make sure it's a monopoly for whites, and, everybody else is third world has to be at your bidding. That's the Yankee approach. That's why they don't deserve to be in UNESCO. They don't deserve it. They don't deserve it. They should be kicked out of UNESCO. So obviously the free flow of private capital in its search for highly profitable returns did not venture forth to spur less developed countries economically forward without the international groundwork of preparation beforehand. Economic free flow, like information free flow, moved in one-way channels designed to maintain established systems of power. The result, according to James Soule, often exaggerated the problems of development rather than solving them, and tended to engender, in the non-recognition of the local cultural context, continuing conflict among those involved rather than a habituation and agreement. So basically, that's the Yankee approach. Basically have it move. You have, established systems of power. They're all corrupt systems of Yankee power, right? They're Yankee corrupt fraud con artist power. And, that will never work. That will never help solve developmental problems. It'll, engender non-recognition of the local cultural context. Forget the local culture. And it'll basically, worsen the whole issue. It'll worsen non-recognition, and it'll continue the conflict among those involved rather than resulting in agreement. So that's the Yankee approach. Keep the conflicts going, keep the people fighting between each other, and there's no development. That's the Yankee, philosophy. That's the Yankee approach to the third world. They're con artist Yankee, liars. All right, so debt service, meanwhile, confirmed the stagnation implicit in unequal bargaining power and resources, right? The U.S. import quotas and tariff preference barriers further limited the power of less developed countries, while the $3 billion annual subsidy to American farmers expanded their access to foreign markets, right? So basically, the Yankees were helping out their own people. The Yankees, they talk about third world, equality, third world. We're into third world people. We're into development and stuff. So then why do you, basically, why do you give $3 billion in subsidies to your farmers and hit heavy tariffs on other, foreign imports, right? Anybody you want to, import your goods, you put them with tariffs, right? That's the Yankee approach to equality and, third world upliftment is, stick them with taxes, stick them with large numbers of fiscal, penalties for, selling their goods in there, racist Yankee, rapist butcher, quack con artist group of Yankees government, right? So that's what it is. They hit them with taxes, and they basically, removed any sort of fiscal benefit from being, in the third world and trading with them. However, the new U.S. development programs did not necessarily suit UNESCO's original mission, dispel inner disagreements about its priorities, or eliminate politicization that has so long characterized its pursuit of peace. It could be argued that promoting development was a form of peace building on the premise that rising standards of literacy and living inculcate a capacity to understand others and become more peaceful as a result. And basically, the proponents of intellectual cooperation in UNESCO focused on a high-level professional interaction were less enthusiastic regarding the practical projects as a somewhat tawdry digression from the educational scientific exchanges, seminars, and conferences that flavored their academic life. So they wanted to basically politicize this organization to be against the third world and a anti-Soviet Yankee imperialism group, right? Make the quick switcheroo of the third world upliftment organization of literacy and all the problems that the colonial rapist butcher Yankees and their friends, created in the third world. And then all of a sudden, you turn it into an organization to, further the imperialism and keep them in check. This is why the Yankees, you need to be out, Yankee. You need to be out. Yankees need to be kicked out of UNESCO. They need to be booted from the UNESCO. They're not prestigious enough. They need to be in their white racist clubs of imperialism. And then they can, do whatever they want and not get anywhere with anything. So we're going to finish up here. As the newly liberated nations emerged and formed alliances in their common impoverishments, they recognized the connection between economic backwardness and exploitation and communication stagnation. So that was what the Yankees were looking for. Communication stagnation, not getting any reading or print material or anything to uplift your actual democratic ideas and train your scholars. Just, the Yankee propaganda, the fraud Yankee, liar, con artist, liar Yankees. That's what they look for, economic backwardness, exploitation, and communication stagnation for the third world. That's their reason to join in UNESCO, to reinstate that sort of stagnation, communication stagnation, exploitation, and basically economic backwardness, promote that, and that's the third world. Continuing on, we had UNESCO greatly enlarged its funding and functioning in education for development. It assisted governments to generate proposals for special fund support, serving as an experimental laboratory for the assessment of educational ideas, and fought energetically to reduce 700 million illiterates in the world community. In education planning, teacher training, and institution building, UNESCO's activity, according to historians, was salient, effective, professional, and non-political. Once UNESCO had been attacked as not relevant in the real world for its failure to enlist in Cold War ideologic battles. In the 1960s, this relevance to the real world could not be doubted. So UNESCO was doing the right thing. They were going in the right direction. We're taking care of illiteracy, 700 million illiterates. The Yankees don't care, right? 700 million illiterates means 700 million easy people to brainwash, right? For them, it's, perfect. That's, UNESCO doing a good job there, right? In education planning, teacher training, institution building, basically salient, effective, professional, and non-political. That's a no-no, right? Non-political, salient, effective, and professional. You don't want effective education for the third world. You want Yankee propaganda, the liar, fraud Yankees, con artist propaganda. That's what we need to train them. Literacy and train the third world education. Thereafter, UNESCO broadened its involvement, thereby stimulating opportunity and achievement in education, science, and mass communication. So the Yankees, mass communication, again, the Yankee frauds. A convention against discrimination in education in 1960 helped open a field in which wider participation. The United States did not sign this anti-discrimination thing. So again, the Yankees are into discrimination. Yeah, we look good, nice, with simple culture. But, nobody gets education other than whites. That's the Yankee approach. That's the Yankee con artist approach. So thereafter, UNESCO took initiatives in planned studies in hydrology, oceanography, geology, seismology, man of the environment, land use, and conservatism. That was excellent. That's a great initiative by UNESCO. And remember the Man and Biosphere program in 1970, managing, the geography of the world. A computerized scientific statistical system called UNISYST, for example, between 1967 and 1971, collected and circulated the scientific information, bibliographies, and aspects. By the early 1970s, UNESCO was supporting development in 119 countries and had 317 large-scale projects underway and an additional 65 teacher training programs. It also provided $81 million in technical assistance to the engineering colleges during the 1960s. Encouraging and learning and access to the tools of knowledge, UNESCO remained a symbol of hope for the third world nations trying to mobilize their human resources to escape from an underdeveloped past. So the Yankees, you're looking to, destroy this organization. It not needs to escape from the third world exploitation of colonial slavery and Yankee, butcher, rapist, con artist action. And then they wanted to, re-enslave them and, get rid of this organization. Cross-cultural studies and projects such as the application of multi-volume history of Africa stimulate the recognition of diffusion of national racial achievements. The Nubian, the monument protection program was another excellent idea, excellent, part of it. Conserving heritage, world culture, and national heritage, which listed important sites in the United States as well, though the United States did not sign as of late 1973. So again, America does not sign the World Cultural National Heritage initiative, right? It's an initiative of worldwide authority that protects world heritage and culture because they want to wage war against colonial states. They want to destroy it because this call for a preservation mandate had already produced the 1954 Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict, to which the U.S. is not a party. So the U.S. is, a colonial group of white Yankee butcher rapists. They want to, be in UNESCO to subjugate the third world, to wage war, destroy monuments, destroy infrastructure, and then, we're still, third world, big shots, nice, skinny, good-looking, Yankees, with the con artist Yankees, but, dead others is fine. Dead, colonial imperialist struggles, dead people is fine. Just as long as we look good and, our press is liars, right? Our press are liars. We look good, everything went perfect. That's the Yankee way. Get them out of UNESCO. Kick up America out of UNESCO. The Yankees need to be expelled from UNESCO. That's my statement. The Yankees need to be expelled from UNESCO. They are going to ruin the organization. They are going to ruin the culture and, education and science. And they're going to end it in a terrible, terrible situation. It will be a terrible thing if the Yankee, butcher, rapist, con artists remain in UNESCO. So again, Hope and Folly, the United States and UNESCO, 1945 to 1985, Preston, Schiller, and Herman. So please join me tomorrow for 25 pages. I'm not going to go through any more quiz questions. I'll have 12 or so quiz questions tomorrow. Again, thank you for your time. See you tomorrow. Have a great day.